The 50 card main deck rule change might matter more than you think. I think some of the good decks right now took a hit because of this rule, and other decks may be back in the meta. Let's take a look at the winners and losers of this change. With Worlds coming up, I will also include some of my predictions and deck lists of decks you should expect to see. Like I mentioned in my previous videos, the percentage of triggers being drive checked or damage checked has now decreased by a good amount. One of the identities I didn't like about Standard is that searching from deck became less about actually getting a card for a specific scenario, but more so used to deck thin. One of these decks is Heroes. You have different heroes that specialize in different things in the base ready to be deployed. But the deck is just all about deck thinning as fast as you can rather than thinking about which cards are best for which scenarios. I think the options you have to both call out units during your turn as well as ones to guard with is a cool mechanic that just can't be fully utilized because of how the deck is optimally built. Same goes for Ava. Choosing a card from the top cards of the deck is more about getting a non-trigger out. There really isn't much thought put into what card is best for the specific case, other than praying that there is a card that's not a trigger from there. With that being said, Ava is one of the decks that was suffering from having too many playables but too little space. With the extra spots, you can now slot in Combine Rushers for a little early aggression, as well as having it as an option for the later game when you run out of Oxidides. You also have decks that just straight out require hitting triggers, like Gravidia. I don't think Glass Cannon decks like this is healthy for the game nor enjoyable to play. In other formats, you have 49 cards in the main deck, since you still have to take out the starter. That's why Standard felt a lot sackier compared to V or Premium, and it's also why Bushi had to make the rule change of only allowing at most 8 of any trigger types. As a side note, I don't think this rule can be reverted at the moment even with the extra cards, because of how powerful searching is currently. Increasing the number of cards in the main deck slows down decks that want to filter out non-triggers and puts more of an emphasis on deck building. This rule change lowers the consistency of a lot of decks. Even with the ability to select going second, I think mass decks are generally worse now. To guarantee to hit both a massive Hydrogram as well as the mass unit on turn 3 requires us to either keep these cards, reducing our early game pressure and guard values, or run multiple bricks and searchers just to up the percentage of seeing these cards. I think Orphis took a gigantic hit. You already had to keep World Orders in your hand for your turn 3 play, and now you also have to dig deeper for the mass cards. Just missing one of these pieces may mean having to wait an extra turn just for your general game plan. And that means guarding against your opponent when your hand is full of cards with 0 shield. Lowering consistency of decks also means that aggro decks are worse as well, since it's harder now to find the pieces necessary to progress with your game plan. This also means that slower decks now have a chance in the meta. Decks that don't really do anything early on, such as the new Stride decks and Shiranui, and some of the Grade 4 decks don't have to worry as much about early rush. Part of the reason is also because chances of our opponent hitting triggers is less likely. I think the best deck for Worlds is Dredruid. It has a decent grade 3 turn compared to its other competitors, and an even better later game because of Ignis and how the supporting cards get consistently soul charged to meet the requirements of the cost for Dredruid. With the ability to attack 5 times every turn while also setting our opponent's power down to 0, it's very powerful. On to my next point. Adding 4 cards to the main deck may mean less consistency for some decks, like the ones I just talked about, but some decks also benefited from this change, like decks that require a lot of pieces and versatility. For example, let's look at Jiva first. There are just too many cards you needed to fit in Jiva to make the deck work. If you count PGs and triggers, that leaves you with only 26 slots in the deck to work with. And then 3 more for Persona Ride, probably another slot for either a Grado or another Regulus piece. So realistically, every deck has only roughly 20 unique cards. Jiva requires so many pieces, from Persona Rise to Trickstars to cross overdress units, and sometimes regular overdress units, and finally Prayer Dragons as well. But now with 4 extra spots, I think we can run a good amount of Prayer Dragon and also cards that help us draw into them. Decks that were having trouble cutting the card count down to 46 will for sure benefit. I think Leonore is actually a great pick for Worlds. One of the reasons why Leonore has been sorted around in the meta is because of its capability to play in the early game as well as transition nicely to the later game. Having 4 extra slots to act as the bridge between aggro and control actually matters quite a lot. With Shiranui and the Triple Drive booster coming out soon for English, expect lyrical decks to be better. Why? Because they have the ability to search out Bracing Angel Ladder with Clear Shimmer Aura, as it's just a constant unhit pressure for your opponent. There are also toolbox-like decks in Standard as well. One of these is Luard. Because Drag Strider requires us to be running a good majority of the ritual cards, we couldn't really fit in more niche cards. But now you can put in cards that counter specific strategies. Another example is Zorga. I think there are a lot of decent orders that just aren't being played because of deck building restrictions. Something that just gives our unit raw power, or when we just need some sort of removal may not have fit previously. I also think there are decks that will have trouble finding cards to put in the deck. There just aren't enough good generic support. For a lot of the order-based decks, we already have Habitable Zone at 4 copies in the deck. And because so many of the in-archetype cards are just plus 5k when certain conditions are met, we're stuck with looking for generic support cards. It doesn't make sense for a lot of these decks to just be running more orders for the sake of filling up the spots. It not only hurts the consistency of finding units, we're also left with cards in our hand that can't be used to guard. As of the recording of this video, we're seeing more generic support cards that can fit in a good majority of decks. But I hope in the future, Bushi will make cards that can fit in specific types of decks, rather than just being applicable to one deck or too good that it can be in every deck. I think Youth Break is now weaker because of this. The cards you are putting in to fill up the slots are quite weak compared to the rest of the deck, but I do still expect to see this deck in Worlds because of its burst potential on turn 3. What do you guys think about the 50 card main deck rule change? Do you think it will have a great impact, or do you think the top decks will still remain as the top decks? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you all in the next video.